8,000 years ago, people harvested grapes where the country Georgia is located today. They brought them home and dropped them into a clay vessel to turn them into wine. So this happened long before the wheel was invented, and right now there are still winemakers in Georgia who pick grapes and drop them into clay vessels to turn them into wine. This is one of the things that I find fascinating about Georgia, and that's why I had to go back there and take you with me. So let's go to Georgia. This here is Georgia. The country of Georgia is also called the cradle of wine, the oldest winemaking country, as archaeologists have found artifacts there that date back to 6000 BC. Because of this long history, winemaking practices are in many places archaic, with winemakers using clay amphoras, the so-called QVEVRIs, to ferment and age their wines. Traditional Georgian white wines are fermented and aged on the skins, just like red wine, which results in an amber or orange wine, a wine style that has become popular again all around the world. Georgia therefore has become a popular destination for wine lovers, but let's back up a little and talk about what makes the country special. Georgia is part of the Caucasus region, with the Black Sea to the west, Russia to the north, and Turkey to the south. In many ways, the country is a border country, being on the border between Europe and Asia, the east and the west, moderate and subtropical climate zones, and this mix really excites me. Georgians have managed to protect their rich culture, and they're proud of it. During my last visits, traditional dances and singing were part of all events. You know, as a stiff German, it's surprising, to say the least, to see teenage boys and manly men dance proudly. But in Georgia, this doesn't seem to be a contradiction. No, it seems to be considered cool to dance, which is great as long as I don't have to dance along. Georgia is a developing country where most things I'm used to are available, but at the same time the country has maintained this certain roughness which makes traveling there exciting. There are highway police chases, damaged roads, rundown areas, and a weirdly high number of missing car bumpers. Talking about cars, I was surprised when I was picked up at a hotel where I was staying and found myself in the left front seat. They have right-hand traffic over there. But sometimes they just buy cars with the steering wheel on the right, just like they have in England, for example, because they are cheaper. One thing I did not expect when I first came to Georgia was the amazing food. Eastern European countries aren't always well known for their cuisine, but Georgian food is delicious and diverse. It is based on high quality fresh ingredients, and there's always a lot of it. Georgians love to eat and drink, and I never left the table not feeling completely stuffed. But now let's get to the wine. Due to its long history with the fermented grape juice, some linguists believe that the root of the word vin, vino, wine is the Kartvelian word chrevino, the Georgian word for wine. But let's get a second opinion on that pronunciation. I'm not really sure whether I did a good job.
Chrevino.
Yeah, I guess that was correct. I found the dichotomy striking between the long history of winemaking in Georgia and the relative youth of the industry. Many wineries I've been to have been established over the last few decades, and the wine industry has changed a lot since the end of the 20th century. During Soviet times, Russia was the main market for Georgian wines, and quality was not a major concern. After the end of the Soviet Union, Georgia continued selling the vast majority of their wines to Russia, as Georgian wines were not really well known anywhere else. However, an embargo was put on Georgian wines by Russia in 2006, which had a huge influence on the wine industry as a whole, and many wineries went bankrupt. Since then, things have changed. There were only 41 exporting wineries registered in 2008, and today there are more than 350 of them. They are still very much dependent on the Russian market, but they have diversified, and Georgian wine is available all around the world. There are roughly 55,000 hectares of vineyards in production in Georgia, and most people make their own wine. Traditionally, there was a QVEVRI built into every house, and families made the wine for their own consumption at home, which highlights the importance of wine in Georgian culture, but also the different approach to it. There are 10 official wine regions all across Georgia, but the most famous one is Kakheti, accounting for 70% of the vineyard total. The climate in Kakheti is less humid than in the west, which is more influenced by the Black Sea. It is continental with warm summers and cold winters. Other notable regions are Kartli, the region surrounding the capital Tbilisi, and the western region of Imereti. The Italians like to brag that they have 500 different grape varieties planted in their country, but in Georgia, a much smaller country, It is actually estimated that they have more than 500 indigenous grape varieties, but most of them are not widely planted, just in very small amounts. But some wineries, like Schumi Winery, for example, have nursery vineyards where all those different grape varieties are kept, propagated, and monitored in order to see which ones can be interesting for larger production. The main varietal for whites in Georgia is Rikatsiteli, which was very popular during Soviet times because you can produce up to 200 hectoliters per hectare with that varietal, which is a lot. But you can also make really interesting still wines, you can make sparkling wines, and you can make really good QVEVRI wines with Rikatsiteli. For reds, Saperavi is used. The varietal produces dark, tannic, acidic, and concentrated red wines. The name directly translates to dye or to give color. And yes, after tasting my way through a bunch of them, my teeth were black. But there are so many other really interesting grape varieties planted in Georgia that you can't get anywhere else, like Kisi, Kuruli Motsvane, Kikvi, Alexandruli, and so on. Counter to the general perception, most of the wines produced in Georgia are not QVEVRI wines. They are white and red wines made in a very similar way to how we operate here in Western Europe. But the QVEVRI wines are obviously really, really exciting and quite special and tend to be the most premium wines from the winery. On my last trip, for the first time, I had the opportunity to see the whole process of QVEVRI winemaking, starting with the production of the QVEVRI itself. I met Zaza, a master of his craft who is the fourth generation of QVEVRI makers, having operated through 2 world wars and the Soviet times. He was a reference when Georgia applied for World Heritage status for QVEVRI production, and while he is a small guy, he carries himself like someone who knows who he is. Apparently, he is one of the last traditional QVEVRI makers left in the Kakheti region, as most of the younger generations have left the countryside and moved to the city in search for better work and living conditions. The QVEVRI production is divided into 3 steps: building the QVEVRI, heating it, and drying it, and Zaza is the only person involved in all 3 steps. Making a QVEVRI is an art form, as it involves sourcing the right type of clay, building the QVEVRI only 10 centimeters per session, and measuring its volume by eye. His standard size QVEVRI can hold 1,500 liters, but the volume can vary by 50 liters from one to another. When finished, one of those QVEVRIs can weigh 700 to 800 kilograms, and it has to be moved out of the cellar by 7 to 8 guys who carry it to the kiln where it is baked. Temperatures in the kiln can reach more than 1000 degrees Celsius. After cooling down, the QVEVRI is coated with lime or cement, and the inside is covered in beeswax. Beeswax is antiseptic, and it helps smooth out the inside of the QVEVRI to make sure that no small particles attach and cause spoilage. On top of that, Zaza believes that the beeswax also helps with the movement of the wine inside the QVEVRI. Back in the day, the QVEVRI or amphoras became the most widely used vessels for making and storing wine, as they were relatively easy to make, easy to transport, and they didn't influence the wine negatively as skins or other vessels would. Since then, winemakers have discovered further advantages. It keeps the wine cool during fermentation if it is buried into the soil, and it also keeps the wine moving, which adds concentration and body to the finished wine. Zaza charges $2,000 per QVEVRI, which is pretty cheap, I would say, if you compare it to a barrique, which can cost roughly the same and which holds far less wine and also is much easier to make. He makes 30 QVEVRIs per year, but he can only work from March to November when the temperatures are warm enough so that the clay can dry. Zaza also makes wines, and he's maybe the only person who gets to make his own wine in his own QVEVRI. I got to taste these wines, and I felt a little bit like Gandalf at Bilbo's house when I sat on this little bench at this little table tasting from this little glass, but the wines were really, really good. At Schumann Winery, I got to see some of Zaza's QVEVRIs as they were preparing them for the harvest. Hygiene, as in most wineries, is very important, but when it comes to QVEVRIs, it's quite tricky. They're small and hard to get into, and workers spend 5 to 6 hours brushing them in order to make sure that they are clean. Traditionally, at the end of each cleaning session, workers were expected to drink some of the water in the vessel to make sure that they actually finished the job. There's a whole assortment of tools that can be used for cleaning, like this brush made of cherry tree bark.
So this feels a little bit claustrophobic, and spending 6 hours here cleaning this must be extremely hard work. So this is like the full circle, tasting the wine from the QVEVRI in the QVEVRI. Good.
Once the QVEVRI is clean, it can be filled with crushed grapes. Traditionally, grapes were trampled by foot in a hollowed out log or stone. This here is not really part of the winemaking process. It's more tourist entertainment, and the ladies loved it. When the grapes are crushed, the berries break and the juice starts flowing. Everything, the skins, juice, and often also the stems are being thrown into the QVEVRI where they start fermenting. Red and white grapes are processed the same way, and this is the key to amber wine, an amber colored wine that was macerated and fermented on the skins. The fermentation usually starts spontaneously, and as the vessel is buried in the soil, the temperature is pretty consistent and pretty cool.
So those are fermenting Kisi grapes in the amphora. And it smells delicious.
The skins are being punched down regularly, and the fermentation takes 20 to 40 days. Red wines are usually pressed off quite quickly after that, and the wine is then aged in QVEVRIs, but white wines stay on the skins until spring, so for a month and months. This is kind of wild. The QVEVRI is sealed under a lid and sand, and no one really knows what's going on underneath. No one does that anywhere else in the world. No one is as hands-off as that. And that's what makes it so interesting. In spring, the QVEVRI is opened again, and you can imagine how exciting this moment is. If something went wrong, you have more than 1,000 liters of vinegar in your cellar, but in most cases the wine comes out fine and it's naturally stable and clean. QVEVRI wine is different. The color is quite dark, the flavor is really intense, and it often smells of apricots and walnuts. The main difference though is the texture. The tannins, the bitterness, the grip. In white wines, that's something really unusual, and therefore can be quite a shock for someone who hasn't experienced anything like it. I personally really like this style if it's made well. It can be a link between white and red wines, combining the freshness of white wine and the texture of red wines. It can also be used to be paired with different dishes, with meaty dishes, with creamy sauces, everything fatty and concentrated, things that you find very often on Georgian tables. The hands-off approach of QVEVRI winemaking is also quite popular amongst natural wine geeks. Natural wine bars often serve Georgian QVEVRI wines, but QVEVRI wine doesn't necessarily have to be natural wine. Most wineries in Georgia are not certified organic, and they also use sulfur, so they are not necessarily making natural wines, they're just making really interesting wines. But it is probably the most traditional way of making white and red wine, the closest you can get to winemaking 1,000 years ago. But like I said, QVEVRI wine only represents less than 5% of the total production. There's also a lot of really exciting white and red wines, sparkling wines, all different kinds of wines coming out of Georgia. The other thing that sets Georgia apart is the wine culture, and Tbilisi, the capital, shows that really well. It's a busy and exciting place with an interesting mix of Soviet and modern architecture, and they have lots of really cool wine bars. Naturally, Leon and I had to spend our last evening wine bar hopping through some of the most well-known wine bars in Tbilisi. It was quiet at Givino when we arrived there, but the staff was very friendly, and Leon had to buy the first bottle as he has lost a bet earlier on the trip. So free wine is always good wine. At 8,000 Vintages, a small chain of wine bars and wine shops, they had a vast selection of different wines and really nice food, and there were even subscribers of this channel working there. Hi guys. Vino Underground was rougher and very hip. They pour some nasty, natty wines, and it was certainly the most interesting place for watching people. I left Georgia filled with great memories. They have everything they need: a rich culture, unique grape varieties, and very special wine styles. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then like it down here. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. My question of the day is, what do you think about Georgian wines? Have you tasted them? Have you not tasted them before? Let me know down below in the comments. I hope I see you guys again very soon. Until then, stay thirsty.